Why is the case that in many corporations, in spite of having very good scanners like Rapid7, Qualys, Nessus, you name it, uh, in fact, some people argue that they are way too good. They find way too much stuff for me to actually fix. And in spite of having the best technology for patching across all platforms like BigFix, why is it that these vulnerabilities keep piling out? And in fact, the bad guy only needs one or two to be left behind for them to exploit, like in the recent case of the Swift uh, exploitation. I will argue that there is a gap between the SOC people, the people that do the scanning and the people that handles the SIEM and the monitoring, and the operations people that are the one that have to do the patching, the remediation. Why is there a gap between those two organizations, and how can we actually breach that path, that gap or chasm, rather? After each scan cycle, let's say every month, some companies are, do it every week. Some of them even more frequent than that. But regardless of the frequency, at the end of that scanning, a big PDF is produced and is sent to the operations people. This is all what we found. You go ahead and fix it. So you need to sit down even in front of a console like BigFix and deal with this massive amount of vulnerabilities to be fixed. But there are some vulnerabilities that do not have a patch. They have to be solved in other ways. There's a minority of them, but a significant minority that need to be dealt with. What happens when the patch actually breaks the application? I cannot, leave my application offline because I apply a patch. I need to figure out all the ways of actually fixing it. And the question is, are there other mitigation besides patching? And as comprehensive as these scanners, these network scanners are, they don't find many of the things that you require an application scanner to go deep into even the source code and find vulnerabilities that escape to the scanner, or database vulnerabilities that are far from being visible to a network scanner. So you still are leaving some stuff out. And if your prioritization is based on CVSS number, that can be really meaningless, and most of the vulnerabilities have a high CVSS number. So this is not very information because it doesn't reflect my network. It might be that something that is very critical elsewhere, it is not in my case, and vice versa. For example, do I know if a vulnerability is being exploited or somebody's attempting to exploit it? Well, that's something that your SIEM may figure out, but not your scanner, not even BigFix as good as it is. In some cases, it is only the information is only, let's say that is the IPS that actually are very good detecting SQL injection and cross-site scripting and those type of attacks. It's normally your IPS, the one that talks to the SIEM and notifies it about it, but it's not really talking to your patching system like BigFix. So you cannot give priority to those, and those are very important. Another important consideration, is this vulnerability, is there a path between that particular vulnerable server and 808.8 to go to the internet? Well, you will need to ask somebody on a networking side if there is such a path between the IP of that server and 808.8. You're not going to do that with thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities. So you cannot take that into consideration, and that's an important one. Is that particular server talking to bad sites like command and control sites, spammers, etc., that are so related with exploitation? I don't know. Your SIEM, if it has a good threat intelligence source, can determine that, but not your scanner. Also, it seems to be that some of the data is on the SOC side or on the operation side, but not on both. So when you want to produce a progress report to show management how good you are doing, you don't have all the data. For example, your scanner can tell you when a vulnerability was discovered by the scanner or when it was published by virtue of the information in the metadata. But it doesn't know when it was patched until you do the next scanning cycle, and that might be way too long. Same way, if you want to put on your part of your report when the vulnerability was actually patched, but that's something that you know on the operation side, but not on the scanning side. Also, the nomenclature in the scanning side and the SOC side is typically CVE, and that's where most of the metadata is. But at least on the Windows side, that nomenclature is that MSS, and these 4 digits are very different from one another. In fact, they have no relationship whatsoever. Also, if I want to put in my progress report everything around about my Windows laptop and desktop, well, I cannot do that with the scanner, because the scanners, in order to find meaningful information, requires a credential scan, and you're not going to have the credentials of all your laptops in there. So that's where BigFix actually does an excellent job on finding that data. But again, this is on the operational side and not on the SOC side, and you want to produce a report that has both. And finally, the vulnerability metadata, so rich. When you open any vulnerability, you see a tremendous amount of data. It's not read by anyone, because again, there are gazillions of these vulnerabilities. I'm not going to process and manage that. Don't worry, I'm going to show you how we solve each and every one of these problems. I'm actually going to demonstrate it live. So the proposed solution is to install on top of QRadar a module called Vulnerability Manager, or QRadar QVM Vulnerability Manager, or actually known as QVM. It also comes with Risk Manager. I'm going to show you the relationship between these two, and a free app called BigFix Patch that completes the bi-directional integration between BigFix and QRadar as an SIEM and as a network scanner. One of the things is that you can have QRadar, like I have in my system, be your scanner, but it doesn't have to be. This technology works, and you can keep, if you have and you're happy, or your Qualys, Rapid7, Nessus, whatever scanner you have gets you depressed enough with the stuff is fine. You can keep it. There's not a requirement. But what you want to do is bring all those vulnerabilities into QRadar. You see why, but also bring vulnerabilities from your application scanner like AppScan and your Guardium database vulnerability scanner as well. So you have all of them, and you begin to actually sort them in ways that make sense. So we start by doing a search, like we do searching in all the parts of QRadar. As we see in this system, we have a great number of vulnerabilities. In fact, let me actually show how many do we have, because we're going to see that number is rather important. So we go and see all the vulnerabilities that we have in this system, and we have 1,811 of them. And actually, I can pivot them and see which instances of those are, because you may have the same vulnerability in one or more server or desktop or device. So out of 1,811 vulnerabilities, I want to do, for example, before I send all this stuff to the BigFix guy, I actually want to perform a search and see which of them BigFix can fix. And how do I know that? Well, first let me actually show you the search. I use this parameter, and I'm going to go through some of these. It's an incredibly rich capability of searching for vulnerabilities, and I look for the former name IBM Endpoint Manager and look at which of them do have, I didn't have to click twice, which of them do have a fix. And actually, it's a very nice number. Of 1,800, I have 1,600 that BigFix can fix, and that's goodness. So I want to concentrate, for example, in the ones that, because I can send, and I'll show you in this demo a beautiful part in which you actually send all these vulnerabilities not on a PDF, but straight into the BigFix console with an interesting prioritization based on this thing that is called the risk score that I will talk some more later. But now, let's say that I want to deal with the vulnerabilities that do not have a BigFix patch. So, well, all I need to do is do the same search as before, but put here does not equal. And there are other sources of vulnerabilities. You see, AppScan, Guardian, you have others. But let's say that I want to find those that cannot be fixed by BigFix. And I get that number, and it's 164 of them. Okay, so these are the tricky ones. Haha. And not to mention that some of these, when you go into BigFix and you try to fix them, they're going to be an exceptions because they may break stuff. But let's deal with the ones that BigFix doesn't have a patch, because let's say Microsoft doesn't have a patch for this or that or whatever. So how do I find other mitigation strategies? Well, you have an IPS, an intrusion prevention system, and those intrusion prevention systems have a mechanism called virtual patch that nobody uses. Why? Because the guy that runs the IPS is very seldom in the meetings where you distribute the vulnerabilities. But you can change that. Let me actually scroll down to some of the search parameters here. And again, there are gazillions of them. But I'm going to put, vulnerability has a virtual path from vendor. And let's say that you have, McAfee, or you have Cisco, Snort, or, let's say that you have Snort in here. And say, well, which of these that BigFix cannot fix could actually be stopped by going into my IPS and telling to deploy a particular signature? That's very powerful. Let's take a look. Look at that, not bad. Out of 160, I believe that there were 47 of them. I can go into Snort, and let's say that I click on this one. Particular, here's the rich metadata that I very seldom take advantage of. And in here, I can see that for Snort, this is the signature that I need to deploy to stop that vulnerability. And if I want to actually shop for IPSs or see, which RPS is better, at least from the virtual patch standpoint, I can actually edit my search. I can remove that criteria, that search parameter, and I'm going to look again for the same parameter, but I'm going to check on some other brand. I can be selecting all the brands. For example, I can go the IPS, the XGS is actually normally, the X-Force is very active on patching, so I would expect this number to be superior, and in fact it's significantly superior. So out of these, these are the ones that I can look at the virtual patch and actually ask my IPS guy to deploy those. And it might be also the case that you have a SQL injection vulnerability, for example, that you cannot patch immediately because the guy needs to revise the code, find the problem, test, and all that. Well, you can see if there is a virtual patch for it. And you can actually ask your IPS guy, hey, my friend, deploy this virtual patch, because I cannot remediate it right away. And I see, for example, as I show you later, that there have been attempts of exploitation of that vulnerability. So your IPS guy will go immediately patch that, do a virtual patch, and that then you can go to your application developers and say, hey, this vulnerability, notice that it's being exploited. It's not something trivial. This is serious, guys. And I put a stopgap measure here on my IPS to fix it, but that's not the permanent way of fixing it. So please fix that. And that's a different proposition than inundating your application developer with gazillions of vulnerabilities that they may not have time to actually fix. Let me now switch to the risk manager. It's a component that comes bundled with with Vulnerability Manager, and they are literally, I mean, I can spend a great deal of time talking about all these policies that you can actually implement to detect bad things happening with some of your vulnerabilities. But I'm gonna just work on two simple ones that I have. One is this one. Let's actually look at this particular policy. Oops, got timeout. So this is a very simple policy I set up to say, well, which of out of the vulnerabilities that you have on servers or desktop, whatever it is, that has communicated to the internet. In other words, there is a path, and Risk Manager is aware of path information and the traffic that is going, and I selected one of the gazillions of options that I have in here. So you can read there. There are very sophisticated policies you can specify in Risk Manager there, and the one that have a CVSS score greater than 5. So I can actually test that particular question and have it evaluated. And this is actually a test. So when you are creating your policy, you actually click on it and look at that. I have these devices that have been part of my network that have been talking to the internet. Well, that if then there is a path there, and that might establish some criteria. And what happened when you find one of those policy violations? Well, remember I mentioned that I will be talking about the risk score. Notice that in here I can say, for example, increase these vulnerabilities 60% when those things actually happen. So I'm going to enable the policy and give it a short while for it. Every time that you make a change on the policy, in about 5 minutes or so, the policy gets evaluated. So pretty soon we're going to see that these vulnerabilities that I have in here, actually go quickly there before it actually gets evaluated. When I sort the vulnerabilities by risk score, the risk score is a number that starts with the CVSS vulnerability. So the max number is 10, and we're going to see that some of these vulnerabilities, for example, those that will be incremented 60% since they were more than 5 on the CVSS score, they're going to go above 10 in here. Let's go back to Risk Manager and see the other policy that I have. And again, this is not a Risk Manager video. There are others that I have created and others that you can see on the network. And I have this other vulnerability that is when vulnerabilities has actually been exploited. And actually I showed in another video where I go into the Metaxploit and I exploit this particular OLE Microsoft vulnerability. The IPS tells QRadar. QRadar connects the dots, fire an offense, and all those good things happen. But also I wanna actually do something on Risk Manager side as well. I want actually, that's the actual policy, and that's on the monitor. What I'm doing in here is actually increasing those vulnerabilities by 100%. So I'm going to enable it to have it run that. So in a few minutes, we should see significant changes on this risk score when the policy gets evaluated, because again, I have the one host that I attacked, that was the one that ended in the 203 address, and I have some devices that have talked to the internet. So in a few minutes, this policy is going to finish running, and the evaluation will increase the risk score. This policy, by default, they run on Risk Manager every hour. Is the shorter that you can make it, or you can make it more extensive. So those policies should be evaluated by now. So let's actually sort here by risk score, and here we are. We have vulnerabilities that were increased 60%. We see that these one are here because they were communicating to the internet, and that was the criteria I gave it. And this one, there are 21 are vulnerabilities that were actually beyond. Actually, I think I ran the policy twice in here, but that were actually exploited. So this one is the OLE vulnerability that got exploited. Let me show you the part. Let's start talking about BigFix. I haven't shown BigFix and the pieces that exist on the integration. So I display here the vulnerabilities based on instances, and This particular host is the one that I actually exploited the actual vulnerability. And by having installed the free application on the application exchange for the X-Force application exchange for QRadar, I have now integration with BigFix. So I can right click on any IP and I can actually say, well, find the patches for that particular IP. So in other words, is BigFix tell me everything you know about it. And there are many things. This is a quite vulnerable machine that I have here precisely for testing. And that vulnerability that we saw was CVE 2014. And notice that the communication is actually live. I mean, as I'm 6332, I believe it was, yeah. In fact, that's the only one. You see how the number gets actually reduced. And this is on the Microsoft world is known as MS 14064. Again, no relationship between the two, but this integration knows about both them all. And this is the one that I actually exploited. And I'm going to be sending these and a few others into BigFix consoles directly to take actions on them. So no longer I have to wait for my scan to fix. If I want to know about a particular vulnerability, I can do it and ask BigFix to tell me what it knows. And in fact, I'm going to ask BigFix to fix this one, and then we're going to ask again for this particular vulnerability, and it should disappear because it's actually been patched, been fixed. And here at the BigFix console, and there's a new dashboard which is manage vulnerable computers, and here it is. I got all that information being sent from QRadar straight into the BigFix console. No more depressing PDS files. And here I have that rescore and prioritized by, hey, this is the most important stuff. Go ahead and take care of them. So I can actually take that vulnerability and let me scroll down and actually ask BigFix, hey, can you please fix that one for me, please? Let me scroll down here and say, take default action. On which computer? On this particular machine. Let me actually scroll down again. So I'm going to pause the video. It's been long enough. I'm going to wait until BigFix actually applies the fixes. It's downloaded. So we see BigFix took care of that vulnerability. We are done. Let's go back to QRadar and actually right click as we did before. We can actually go to that path, but that puts that there. Let's look for that CVE 2014. Notice that the numbers have been reduced, 6332, and it's not there because it's actually been fixed. And you know, from here I can speak both languages, both lingos. I can do MS 14. Notice the numbers get reduced, 064, and it's not there. 063 and others are, but not that. So it's actually been fixed. You see, I hope I have demonstrated in this rather long video how you can eliminate the gap, the chasm between SOC and operation, and you can actually avoid piling up those vulnerabilities and produce nice report that contains the information from both ends.